The room went completely silent the moment she walked through the door. Not the polite silence of recognition, not the respectful pause given to rank, but the sharp, loaded silence of men who had already decided what they were looking at and were certain they were right. 12 Navy SEALs, each carrying years of combat deployments and elite training behind their eyes, turned to face a woman who stood 5 feet 7 inches tall, wearing the uniform of a Marine Corps combatives instructor. She had no expression on her face, no smile meant to soften the tension, no hesitation in her step. She moved to the center of the mat like someone who had lived there her whole life, because in every way that mattered, she had. One of the SEALs near the back let out a low laugh, not bothering to conceal it. Another muttered something just audible enough to be cruel. And then the team leader stepped forward, arms crossed, jaw set, and said it plainly, the kind of thing that gets said when people mistake composure for weakness and stillness for surrender. You made a mistake coming here. She turned toward him slowly, and something shifted in the room. Not fear, not anger, something quieter and far more dangerous than either. She looked at him the way a mountain looks at weather. She had heard those words before, in different rooms, from different mouths. She had heard them her entire career. The question every person in that room was about to discover the answer to was this. What happens when the person everyone counted out was, in fact, the only one in the room who was exactly where they were supposed to be? Her name was Gunnery Sergeant Elena Voss, and she had never once in her life taken the easy road, not because the easy road was unavailable to her, but because she had understood from an early age that character is not built on convenience. It is hammered out in the places where most people turn back. Growing up in a small town in eastern Tennessee, she had watched her father, a Marine veteran of the Gulf War, wake before the sun every single morning without complaint, without fanfare, and without explanation. He never had to explain. She understood it through osmosis, the way children understand the true values of a household long before they can name them. Discipline, duty, and the quiet dignity of doing what needed to be done even when no one was watching. Those were not lessons she was taught at a desk. They were breathed into her before she ever picked up a textbook. She enlisted in the Marine Corps at 18, the same week she graduated high school. And the recruiter at the station in Knoxville looked at her with that particular blend of surprise and mild condescension that she would come to recognize as a kind of fuel over the years. She was not the first woman to walk through that door, but she may have been the first to walk through it with quite that level of specific, focused certainty. She knew what she was there for, and she was not interested in being talked into a different path. She had researched Marine combatives. She had spent 2 years training in mixed martial arts at a local gym just to understand the physical language of what she was pursuing. She came prepared, and preparation, she had already learned, was one of the few things in life that could not be faked. Boot camp tested her in ways she had not entirely anticipated. Not the physical demands, those she had trained for relentlessly, but the social architecture of being a woman in a space that had not always been designed with her presence in mind. There were women in her platoon who crumbled under the social pressure faster than they crumbled under the physical pressure, and she understood that. Isolation can be its own kind of weight. But Elena Voss was not built for crumbling. She was built for endurance. She learned during those weeks that leadership is not about volume. The loudest voice in the room is rarely the most powerful one. She watched the drill instructors who were most effective and noticed that their authority came not from how much they shouted, but from how completely they meant every word they said. She filed that lesson somewhere permanent. By the time she graduated and moved into her first assignment, her reputation for technical precision and physical capability had already begun to form. She was the Marine who stayed on the mat after everyone else had gone. She was the Marine who asked not how to pass a standard, but how to exceed it. She was, in the language of those who watched her, someone worth watching. The path to becoming a Marine Corps combatives instructor was not a straight one, and Elena had not expected it to be. The military combatives program demanded a level of technical mastery that went far beyond what most people associated with military hand-to-hand training. It was not about brute force, and it was not about spectacle. It was about the systematic application of pressure, leverage, timing, and psychological control in environments where the margin for error was measured in seconds and the consequences of failure could be irreversible. She understood that from the first day of her formal combatives training, and it changed the way she thought about everything, not just fighting. She earned her Level 1 certification and immediately began working toward Level 2 with the kind of obsessive consistency that her peers alternately admired and found mildly unsettling. She was not training to prove a point to anyone else. She was training because the work itself demanded it, because she could feel the gaps in her knowledge, and she refused to be comfortable with gaps. Her instructors noticed. The good ones always do. They noticed not just that she was skilled, but that she understood the principles behind the skills, that she could explain the mechanics of a technique while executing it, that she had the rare quality of being able to teach as naturally as she could fight. Her first posting as a junior instructor brought its own set of challenges. She was responsible for training Marines who in several cases outweighed her by 80 pounds and who arrived at the mat with the assumption that their size and prior training experience made them difficult to teach. She had learned to read that attitude from across a room. It had a particular texture to it, a certain looseness in the posture that signaled a man who has decided the outcome of a session before it has begun. She developed a specific methodology for those situations. She did not argue with assumptions. She addressed them directly, on the mat, through demonstration, through the clean, undeniable physics of a technique executed perfectly against a resisting opponent. She was not cruel about it. She did not embarrass anyone unnecessarily. But she was absolutely, unambiguously clear. Over 7 years, she built a record that her commanding officers cited repeatedly in evaluation reports. She trained hundreds of Marines. She mentored junior instructors. She contributed to curriculum development in ways that reflected both her technical depth and her understanding of how people actually learn under stress. She received her Level 3 certification, one of only a small number of women in Marine Corps history to do so at that point. And she accepted that recognition with the same composure she brought to everything else. It was not a destination. It was a marker along a road she had no intention of leaving. The invitation to provide a joint training session at a naval special warfare facility came through official channels and was framed, as these things sometimes are, in language that was polite but carried an undercurrent of skepticism. A Marine combatives instructor providing instruction to a SEAL team. The idea was not unprecedented, but it was uncommon. And Elena understood from the way the invitation was worded that she was walking into a room where her credibility would be challenged before she ever opened her mouth. She accepted without hesitation. She arrived at the facility the evening before the training session and spent the night the way she always spent the night before something significant, reviewing her material. Running through the progression of techniques she intended to introduce, thinking about the probable points of resistance, and then sleeping. Sleep was a discipline too, and she had learned years ago that anxiety before a high-stakes situation was only useful if it was converted into preparation. Once the preparation was complete, anxiety had no more work to do, and she sent it away. The morning session began with what she had expected. 12 SEALs in the training space. A combination of genuine curiosity and performative skepticism distributed in roughly equal measure across the group. Their team leader, a chief petty officer named Rains who had 3 combat deployments and a brown belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, was the one who had spoken the words that landed in the room like a stone in still water. "You made a mistake coming here." She had heard variations of that sentence across her entire career, and she had developed, over time, a very clear understanding of what it actually meant. It did not mean she was in the wrong place. It meant the person saying it was uncomfortable with the disruption of their expectations, and discomfort, she had found, was one of the most productive starting points available. Discomfort meant something was being challenged. Something being challenged meant something could be changed. She set her bag down on the mat and looked at Rains for exactly as long as necessary before she spoke. She told the group that she was not there to compete with them, and she was not there to prove anything about herself or about women in the military or about the Marine Corps relative to naval special warfare. She was there because they had requested joint training and because she had something to offer that might be useful to them in environments where a firearm was not an option. She asked them to be present for 2 hours and to evaluate the content on its merits. And then she began. The first 30 minutes were technical, deliberate, and patient. She walked them through the foundational mechanics of positional control, explaining not just the how but the why behind every principle. connecting each concept to the kinds of real-world scenarios they would actually encounter. She watched their body language shift. The performative skepticism began to lose its structural integrity somewhere around the 40-minute mark, when she asked for a volunteer to demonstrate a resistance drill and Rains stepped forward. She did not invite him to test her. She invited him to participate in a learning exercise. The distinction mattered. What followed was not a fight. It was a demonstration, but it was a demonstration so precise, so controlled, and so technically undeniable that the room changed again. In the same way a room changes when a truth arrives that cannot be argued with. Rains was good. She had known he would be, and she had respected that going in. He was strong, technically capable, and possessed the particular kind of physicality that comes from years of real training layered over genuine combat experience. He was not a man who could be managed through simple tricks or momentum tricks. He would need to be addressed on the level of principle, and Elena met him there. When she neutralized his first attempt at a dominant grip, she did not pull away from it. She redirected it, using the energy of his own movement to reposition herself in a way that changed the geometry of the exchange without requiring her to match his strength. She explained what she was doing as she was doing it, not as a way of showing off, but because she had found that real-time narration during a demonstration collapsed the distance between watching and understanding. She wanted them to see it and grasp it simultaneously. The second exchange was slower, more deliberate on his part, because he was adjusting. She respected the adjustment. Adaptation under pressure was a quality she admired in anyone she trained. She let him find the edge of his revised approach, and then, with a control that was almost surgical, she demonstrated precisely why that approach still carried a vulnerability he had not accounted for. She brought him to the mat cleanly and without drama, held the position for 3 seconds, and then released and stood. Nobody laughed. Nobody muttered. The room had been completely reorganized by what they had just witnessed, not because they had seen a woman beat a seal, that was not the story, but because they had seen a master of a craft demonstrate that craft at a level that commanded genuine respect regardless of who was delivering it. The lesson embedded in that moment was one that Elena had been carrying for years and trying to teach in every room she entered. Competence has no gender, and expertise will eventually speak loudly enough to be heard over any noise. The remaining hour of the session moved differently. The skepticism had not disappeared entirely, because skepticism that has existed for a long time does not dissolve in 90 minutes. But it had been cracked open, and light was getting through. She moved through the group, working with each of them individually, finding the specific technical habits that needed refinement, identifying the particular gaps that repetition and confidence had papered over, and offering corrections that were precise, respectful, and immediately useful. One of the younger SEALs, a petty officer who could not have been more than 24, stayed close to her during each demonstration and asked questions that revealed a genuinely hungry mind. He asked about the underlying principles, about how the techniques translated across different body type matchups, about the psychological dimensions of controlling a situation without escalating it. She answered everything thoroughly, and at the end of the session he told her quietly that it was the most useful 2 hours he had spent on a mat in 3 years. She thanked him without performance and meant it. What happened after the session was in some ways more significant than the session itself. Because the real test of a training experience is not what occurs on the mat, but what takes root afterward in the minds of the people who were there. Elena had understood this for years. You could teach a technique in an afternoon, but teaching someone to think differently about a problem, to approach a physical or tactical challenge from a new angle, took longer and required a different kind of investment. Rains found her before she left the facility. He was not the kind of man who found apologies easily, and she did not require one. But what he offered her was something she valued more than an apology. He told her that he had expected to be unimpressed, and that he had been wrong to arrive with that expectation, and that he intended to work some of what she had shown him into the team's regular training rotation. He said it simply and without decoration, the way people who are being genuinely honest tend to speak. She nodded, shook his hand, and told him his team had been good to work with. She drove back to the base in the late afternoon, the sun low and red behind the hills, and allowed herself a few minutes of something that was not quite pride, but was adjacent to it. It was the quiet satisfaction of having done the work correctly, of having served the purpose she had set for herself, of having walked into a difficult room and left it better than she found it. That, she had always believed, was the actual measure of leadership. Not whether you were recognized, not whether you were celebrated, but whether the people around you were more capable after you had been in their presence than they were before. She thought about the younger SEAL who had asked the good questions, and she thought about what would happen if he carried those questions forward into his training and eventually into the field. She thought about the invisible chain of influence that runs through teaching, the way a single well-delivered lesson can travel forward through time in ways the teacher never directly witnesses. It was one of the reasons she had chosen this work, not just because she loved the craft of combatives, but because she understood that the craft was a vehicle for something larger. Every person she made more effective on the mat became more survivable in the field. Survivability was not an abstract concept. It was the difference between a Marine or a SEAL coming home or not coming home. She had chosen a path that most people around her had not expected her to choose, and she had walked it without asking for permission and without waiting for validation. The resistance she encountered had been real. The moments of isolation had been real. The exhaustion of constantly having to establish credibility in rooms where it should have been assumed had been genuinely costly. But she had learned something through that cost that she could not have learned any other way. She had learned that the people who most need to see something done are often the ones most committed to believing it cannot be done. And the most powerful thing you can offer those people is not an argument. It is an example. The months following the joint training session produced results that Elena was not directly informed of for some time, because the nature of her work meant that feedback traveled slowly and through indirect channels. But eventually word reached her through the network of instructors and training coordinators that several members of the SEAL team she had trained had begun actively incorporating Marine combatives principles into their unit's preparation, and that Raines had requested her participation in a follow-up session that was longer and more intensive than the first. She prepared for the follow-up with the same rigor she brought to everything, building a curriculum that would advance the concepts from the initial session into more complex territory, addressing the kinds of scenarios that operators at that level actually encountered, training situations that existed at the intersection of physical technique, environmental awareness, and psychological composure under extreme stress. She consulted with fellow instructors, reviewed recent field reports, and refined her material until it was exactly what it needed to be. Not impressive for the sake of impression, useful for the sake of use. The second session ran for 2 full days, and the room that Elena entered on that first morning was fundamentally different from the room she had walked into several months earlier. Not in its composition, most of the same team members were present, but in its atmosphere. She was welcomed not as a curiosity and not as a challenge, but as an instructor. It was not a dramatic transformation. It was quiet and professional, which was exactly as it should be. Genuine respect in military culture rarely announces itself loudly. It shows up in posture, in attention, in the quality of questions asked, in the willingness to set aside prior assumptions in the service of learning something real. She spent 2 days doing the work she loved at the level she had spent her entire career preparing for. She was rigorous and patient and honest about the limits of any technique, because one of the most important things she had always taught was that no system of training was complete. The most dangerous operator was not the one who knew the most techniques, but the one who overestimated the techniques they knew. Humility about the limits of your own preparation was not weakness. It was the foundation of sound tactical thinking. On the final afternoon, she ran the group through a series of scenario-based exercises that required them to integrate everything from the 2 days into adaptive responses against unpredictable conditions. She watched them work and saw the difference between where they had started and where they were finishing, and that difference, measured not in performance scores, but in the quality of their decision-making under pressure, was the most meaningful thing she could have taken from the experience. She had not just taught them techniques. She had contributed to how they thought about close-quarters problems, and that contribution would outlast her presence in their training rotation. When she left on the final evening, there was no ceremony. There rarely was in her life, and she preferred it that way. She carried what she always carried when she left a room where real work had been done, the steady knowledge that she had been exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she had trained her whole life to do. Gunnery Sergeant Elena Voss did not set out to become a symbol. She set out to be a Marine, and she committed to that with an intensity that most people reserve only for things they cannot imagine living without. But the story of her life in uniform became something larger than she intended, not because she sought recognition, but because she refused to accept invisibility. Not through protest or confrontation, but through the daily, relentless practice of excellence. Her story is not primarily about gender, though gender cannot be removed from it, because the resistance she faced was real and it was tied to assumptions that had been embedded in military culture for generations. Her story is about what happens when someone refuses to let the expectations of others set the ceiling on their own potential. It is about the kind of courage that does not make headlines, the courage of showing up again and again to a room that has already decided what you are, and choosing to demonstrate something different every single time. She taught Marines and SEALs and junior instructors, and anyone else who was willing to be in her presence with an open mind. She taught them combatives, yes, but she also taught them something that no formal curriculum captures cleanly. She taught them that expertise commands respect regardless of its container, that the measure of a person in a military context is the measure of what they can do and who they make better, and that the most powerful thing any leader possesses is the willingness to be honest, thorough, and unconditionally present in the work. What she built over her career was not a legacy in the formal sense of monuments and citations, though those came too. What she built was a chain of capable people who carried pieces of what she had given them into situations she would never see, making decisions and surviving circumstances that her training had quietly made possible. That is what the best teachers and the best leaders do. They pour themselves into others and trust that what they have given will travel further than they themselves can go. To every person who has ever walked into a room and heard, directly or indirectly, the message that they did not belong there, that they had made a mistake, that the space was not designed for them. The answer to that message is not a speech. The answer is the work. Do it completely. Do it honestly. Do it at the highest level you are capable of, and then let the room decide for itself what it witnessed. Elena Voss did not make a mistake coming there. The room made a mistake underestimating her. And by the time anyone understood the difference, she had already changed everything.